We are the product of genetic mutations that occurred 200,000 years ago in a way that cannot be explained by nature alone, that gives us everything we need to not only adapt, but to thrive when we're faced, when life brings something to our doorstep like we find right now. So we are made for this. Our bodies are so smart, Brian, the intelligence of our bodies know precisely what to do. And this is what I want to say to our viewers right now, is that you are, I'm going to look you right in the camera, right in the eye, you are made for times like this. Your body knows what to do. Our job is to support the intelligence of our bodies by giving our bodies all the things that we know our bodies need, by honoring our bodies, by honoring the gift of our lives, through all the things that we already know that now take on even a greater significance: nutrition, movement, exercise. Ideally, if we lived in an ideal world, we would get all of our nutrients from food. We all know our soil is so depleted that can't happen. So supplements are important.
COVID-19 is something even more unique, right? When you look at this thing, it's very different than other things we've seen before. And like you said, our human bodies have never seen it before, whereas the flu virus, we've been dealing with that, proven for thousands of years.
Yeah, well, it is not the flu, and this was part of the mismessaging that was happening early on. People were thinking it was just a bad flu. It's not the flu. The influenza virus has been around. We know from archaeological remnants, it's been around over 2,000 years. So our bodies have had 2,000 years to know what to do and to develop antibodies to the many different variations of influenza. A mortality rate less than 1% in the human population now. This is a new virus. We've never seen it before. Our bodies, it's going to take some time, Brian. It will take a season for our bodies to learn what to do and how to develop the antibodies. We will develop, as a species, we will develop the antibodies. The problem is that, I'm just going to back off. If an individual, and I'm going to talk right to the camera, right to our viewers. Viewers, if you have a reasonably strong immune system, the chances of succumbing to this, of dying from this virus, are very, very small. The problem is that many people are immune compromised and don't know it, Brian. This is where the issues are coming in. As a scientist, I'm fascinated by this. The CDC and the World Health Organization identify factors that all contribute to being immune compromised, and some people are surprised by those factors. So they list among those factors, smoking tobacco is a factor, diabetes is a factor, overweight, obesity is a factor, as well as other factors that we would suspect if you already have asthma, or if you already have a heart condition, if you have undergone chemotherapy or had cancer recently. The chemotherapy and radiation, we all know, compromises the immune system as well. So there are a lot of people that fall into those different categories that may not have thought about themselves as being immune compromised. And this is the vulnerable population that we really have to take care of and help them now as we go through what we're going through. A virus does not even meet the biological definition of life. And this is what makes it so interesting. People say, well, if it's not alive, how can we kill it? And we can't kill it. You can't kill what is not alive. What we're doing is we're trying to deactivate it. It is, you can think of it as information. All a virus is genetic information, DNA, very simple DNA, and that's going to be important in a moment. Very simple DNA that is wrapped in a lipid protein shell that protects it. And as long as that shell is intact, that is when the DNA is viable. Simple things like washing our hands actually break down that outer shell so that the information in that virus is no longer viable. Some of the supplements that I've mentioned in some of the other programs are antiviral supplements. Mushrooms, for example. There are peer-reviewed studies of mushrooms. Very specific kinds of mushrooms. Agarikon is an antiviral mushroom. Turkey tail, an antiviral mushroom. Some reishi. Reishi has some antiviral as well as antibacterial effects. And the reason they work is because this virus, it's a spherical virus that has protrusions on the outside. Some people are calling them spikes, but when I see them under the microscope, they look more like protrusions. They don't look like, sharp, pointy spikes. Those protrusions are looking for places on the exterior of our cells. Receptors is what they're called, where they can dock, just like a space shuttle docks to the space station, is what they're doing. So the viruses are looking for a place to dock, and the supplements, the antiviral supplements, such as the mushrooms and some of the traditional Chinese medicines, yin chow, for example, what they do is they blunt those protrusions or deactivate those proteins so that even though they may find a human cell, they cannot communicate with that cell, so they're meaningless to us. We're not infected by the virus. So this is, it is a very bizarre way of thinking that's something that we cannot even see with a naked eye. It's hard to see with a microscope, and it is something that's not even alive, has just changed our planet forever. What I don't see anyone talking about is what's happening to us emotionally. And what I've seen in my own community, and I've seen it in my physical community, and I've seen it in my digital community online, is there's a lot of anger, there is resentment, there's confusion, there is frustration, there is depression. And what I want to say to our viewing audience right now is that our entire planet, for the very first time, I don't think we've ever had this in recorded human history. For the first time, we are simultaneously going through a process of grief. We are all in grief, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or subconsciously, and whether we acknowledge it or not. We are all in grief. And the question is, what are we grieving? And the answer to that surprises a lot of people. We are grieving the loss of a way of life. The way that we were living our lives 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, we've lost that. It's been taken from us. We're social beings, and we are no longer able to gather together the way that we have in the past. Conferences, social gatherings, meals in restaurants, athletic events, concerts, all of the movies, all of those kinds of things. And that loss to us is like any other loss. And in the process of grief, and I can't do a better job than Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did, talking about the grief cycle. So I'm going to hold this up. The grief cycle often is, we hear about in terms of death. When someone dies, the 5 stages of accepting that death. The death is a form of loss. We are experiencing another kind of loss, but the 5 stages still apply. So very quickly, those 5 stages, the first one is denial, the second one is anger, the third is depression, the fourth is bargaining, and the fifth is acceptance. The characteristics of denial is fear. So many people are in fear, shock, confusion, avoidance. The characteristics of the anger, anxiety, and we're having a lot of people saying they're dealing with anxiety issues, problems sleeping, frustration, they're irritable, depression, the characteristics of that, feeling overwhelmed, helpless, wanting to just run away. So we are, as a planet, we're dealing with this, and I think it's important to acknowledge this, Brian, so that we can move through. It gives a structure. First of all, by acknowledging this, acknowledging these stages of grief, it gives us a structure within which to view what's happening to us right now. So it's not just like coming at us from all over for no apparent reason. There is a reason. We're in grief because we've lost a way of life. When we go through those stages, we can go through these stages relatively quickly if we acknowledge and embrace them, or we can drag them out by refusing to acknowledge what's happening. So the denial, the anger, the depression is pretty much, I think, where most people are, somewhere in there right now. We're trying to get to the bargaining and the acceptance. Some people are in the bargaining stage right now, where we're looking for meaning, we're reaching out to others. The acceptance is where we begin looking beyond what's happening now. We accept it, we embrace it, and we say, okay, what's next? Where do we go? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this is happening to us, number one. How can we deal with the problem unless we're honest with ourselves about the problem? There have always been 3 ways that we could deal with this virus. The first was to contain the virus. When the first cases became known, to contain and isolate those, and that has been successful in the past. The Ebola virus, for example, there was one case that was discovered in the state of Texas here in the United States. That man was put into a very special quarantine unit that had been designed for precisely those kinds of experiences. That virus never escaped that containment, and it never found its way into the general population, so that we know that containment can work. We missed that window. For a lot of reasons, we're past containment. We can't do that now. So now what we're trying to do is what's called mitigation. This wave of virus is rolling across the planet, and we know now that we're not going to stop that. The question is, can we mitigate, is the term that's being used. Can we regulate how it shows up? The concern has been that if it goes unchecked, that so many people in such a brief period of time will have the symptoms, and so many of those people are in the vulnerable demographic, the population that's most vulnerable, that the healthcare systems in Europe, in the UK, and the US will be overwhelmed because they're not set up for those numbers of people. Then we find ourselves in the position of not being able to help those who are critically in need, and that's when the mortality rate goes up. So by social isolation, the thinking is we're not going to stop it, but we're going to stop how quickly, rather than have that big, we've all seen this chart by now, the big steep curve that overwhelms the system, that we're going to spread that out over time. People are still going to get this, it's still going to be transmitted, but it's not going to be that big hump. That's what the isolation is all about. And when we end the isolation, whenever it is, this is the question, what happens next? In an ideal world, what would happen is that the isolation has been so complete that people have followed those recommendations to such a degree that the virus has burned itself out, and that we all go back to our lives. The reality is that not everyone is following those, and when this quarantine period is over, that virus is still going to be viable in some segments of our population. That is pretty much a given right now. So when we end the isolation, we will probably see an uptick again, but we aren't going to see that big curve, and the healthcare system can manage it, and hopefully enough people have developed an immunity. Either a natural immunity, which is, they're thinking some people may actually have a natural immunity, or an immunity because they have had the virus and survived it. And by this time, some of these fast-track medications may help to create that. And then we're looking ultimately at what's called a herd immunity. So that's where things are.